So we are continuing on in our statement now from Christian Temperance and Bible Hygiene by Ellen White, page 109. The last thing that we looked at was the idea that real experience is gained by a variety of careful experiments. Now, this next part continues on that sentence and it adds some additional aspects which are equally important. So I'll read the first part of the sentence again for context, and then we'll examine this second part. Real experience is gained by a variety of careful experiments made with the mind free from prejudice, uncontrolled by previously established opinions and habits. Okay, so there's a number of aspects here. First is that these experiments must be made with the mind free from prejudice. In other words, if you have a certain possible result to your experiment that you don't like, that isn't going to help you in coming to the truth. Because what are you going to do? Are you going to end up consciously or subconsciously altering the experiment or altering the results in order to harmonize with your idea? That's not going to give you the truth. You have to remove your prejudices. If there's a certain result that you want or a certain result that you don't want, that is not going to help you. Again, it's just you're putting yourself in risk by having preference to alter things, to tweak things to your own desired outcome. So that won't give you the truth. You have to do the experiment with an indifference as to what the outcome is. Your only desire should be to know the truth, and whatever turns out to be the truth, you should be happy to go with that. In fact, if you have another perspective and you just desire something else and it's not true, how long is that going to last? You know, you won't be able to hold on to an error forever. The truth will have the day, in other words. Okay, so mind free from prejudice, and also uncontrolled by previously established opinions and habits. So, if your mind is controlled by a previously established opinion, what is that like? Well, let's just give the example of Galileo. In the days of Galileo, it was a previously established opinion that the Earth was the center of the universe. Well, if Galileo's mind had been controlled by that previously established opinion, he would not have had the impact from the discovery that he made. Now, he would have still perhaps seen what he did, but if he allowed his mind to be controlled by that previously established opinion, he would have tried to find a way to reason around the evidence. Try and find a way to say, okay, even though I'm seeing things out there where it looks like, you know, something's going around Jupiter or something's going around another planet, he would have tried to find a way to reason it out that still the Earth is the center of the universe. Everything goes around the Earth. Well, I'm glad that his mind was not controlled by previously established opinions. This is, again, just so very important. Now, what if your mind is controlled by previously established habits? Well, if you have a certain habit, let's say an eating habit or a drinking habit or something like that, and your mind is controlled by that habit, or it might even just be a habit of thinking, who knows? If you do an experiment which has potential to undermine the validity of your habit, well, if your mind's controlled by your habit, then you will end up trying to find a way to reason around the inevitable results of your experiment, either by altering them or by twisting the implications in order to hold on to your habit. That isn't going to be helpful. You risk degrading your experiment. You risk destroying its validity. So this is, again, it must be avoided at all costs. We will never have true knowledge if we destroy our experiments in order to make them harmonize with our desired outcomes. So continuing on in this statement. So this is describing real experience and how there must be a variety of careful experiments. Now, the results are marked with careful solicitude and an anxious desire to learn, to improve, and to reform on every point that is not in harmony with physical and moral laws. Okay, so the results are marked with careful solicitude. Now, again, this was written in the 1800s. Solicitude perhaps had a slightly different nuance. When I first read this statement, I didn't know what the word solicitude meant, so I looked it up, and it basically means care, to be very careful, have some sort of extreme care. So to say careful solicitude seems a little bit redundant, so I'm not sure. I'd have to check, and maybe one of you will check if in the 1800s solicitude had a slightly different nuance that would make this less redundant. But in either case, we get the general idea. The point here is that to have real experience and to conduct genuine experiments, we have to mark the results very carefully. We can't just do an experiment and, oh, well, yeah, this thing kind of happened, and, not really taking note of it. No, we have to be very careful and to pay close attention to it, to mark the results, to see, okay, well, what are the true results of this? Because if you're doing a variety of careful experiments, but you don't really pay close enough attention to the results of one of them, you will then be unable to relate your various experiments one to another. To go back to the earth bag thing, if you have, let's say you do 20 experiments with earth bags, but you only carefully marked the results of 5 of them, and then another 5 you were a little bit more careful, and the rest you're just kind of going off memory, well, you won't really be able to compare them. Well, in this experiment, which earth bag stood up the best out of the 10? Well, I think it was one of these 4. If you have that, you're not going to be able to compare and get solid results. You need to take careful note, to mark the results with careful solicitude. So, and you must have an anxious desire to learn. If you don't really care what the results are, and you don't really care to obtain an understanding of what your experiment has potential to teach you, well, how careful will you really be? Now, it's important to have an anxious desire to learn and to reform. Well, actually, before this, Ellen White says to improve. So to improve, or to get better, whether at doing the experiment or at doing the task which you are attempting to discover more about through your experiment, whatever it may be, you should be really trying to improve. If you don't care about improvement and you don't care about learning, you won't get far with experimentation. And to reform on every point that is not in harmony with physical and moral laws. Okay, so let's say you do an experiment and it has to do with heating your food. Well, if you've been in the habit of heating a certain vegetable, let's say, at a certain temperature, and then you do experiments and you find that, hey, you know what? If I heat this food at this temperature, so much nutrition is lost. If I heat it at this temperature, a lot less nutrition is lost. Well, if you do experiments and discern that, well, in order to have a genuine experimental mindset and to be able to forward yourself and advance in experiments, you have to actually change your behavior in response to what you learned by your experiment. And if you don't change, you're not going to really be moving forward. In fact, just look at the modern technological revolution. If people did not implement the things that they learned through experimentation in terms of advancing technology, they wouldn't put themselves on the next platform, which they need to be on, in order to advance to the next stage. Advancement requires action. You have to act according to what you learn in order to be in the place where you can learn the next thing and advance beyond that. So that's physical laws, but it also applies to moral laws. If we do experimentation, and we can even do experimentation concerning our own selves and our own behavior to see whether our behavior is actually loving or unloving. And if we do experiments and find, hey, wait a second, my behavior is actually hurting someone. Perhaps you didn't realize it before, but perhaps something that you're doing is hurting another individual. Well, in order to advance morally, you must reform your behavior to now come up to the moral standard which you have found through experimentation. So again, this is all so very important. There's many more things to discuss though, so we're not going to stay too long on any given point. Let's go to the next paragraph. That which many term experience is not experience at all. It has resulted from mere habit, or from a course of indulgence, thoughtlessly and often ignorantly followed. There has not been a fair trial by actual experiment and thorough investigation, with a knowledge of the principles involved in the action. Experience which is opposed to natural law, which is in conflict with the unchangeable principles of nature, is not to be relied upon. Superstition arising from a diseased imagination is often arrayed in opposition to reason and to scientific principles. To many a person, the idea that others may gainsay what he has learned by experience seems folly and even cruelty itself. But there are more errors received and held through false ideas of experience than from any other cause. There are many invalids today who will ever remain such because they cannot be convinced that their experience is not to be relied upon. I hope that you can all see how important these principles are. Again, there's a lot there. We're going to have to go back to the beginning of the paragraph and kind of break it down because we don't want to miss the lessons that are taught here. So let's look at the first part. That which many term experience is not experience at all. It has resulted from mere habit, or from a course of indulgence thoughtlessly and often ignorantly followed. So first let's look at habit. Well, often people have some sort of habit. Let's just say someone has a habit of waking up in the morning and drinking a beer. Well, someone may wake up in the morning, drink a beer, and then end up having a decent day, and do that day after day after day, and conclude, hey, look, I've been drinking a beer every morning for the past 14 years, and I've had no problems. And they may conclude, hey, look, I know by experience, look, I've been doing this for 14 years. Seriously, believe me, it's good. There's a big problem with that. That habit is not a careful experiment. It's just a habit, and you happen not to have negative results from it that you've noticed yet. That doesn't tell you much as to whether or not drinking a beer every morning is a good idea. So, anyways, there's much more to discuss. I'm going to have to stop this video now because we're coming to the end of our time, but we will continue on in the next part of this series.